Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Biotechnologies, a Canadian company providing made-in-Canada inoculants and biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Let us help you find the best solution and access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Reach us at 1-855-XITEBIO or at excitebio.ca.
Thank you to our show sponsors, the Canola School, Ruminating with RealAg, and MMP. With deep roots in agriculture, MMP's farm management consulting team helps farm businesses make confident decisions for long-term success. From strategic planning to operational growth, MMP advisors guide farms through challenges and opportunities. Connect with MMP today to build a stronger future. Learn more at mmp.ca.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Agronomists. I'm Peter Johnson. I'm sitting in for Lindsay Smith tonight, and we are going to have a ton of fun. By the way, Mark, I don't get to choose the music. That's Jay. But if I got to choose the music, it would probably be Steppenwolf with Born to Be Wild. Yes, so we are talking soybean seeding rates tonight, and that, I mean, a lot of people I think are saying, "Oh, again, you've done that," but there's new information. There's a whole range of stuff happening out there that I really think we can delve into and get some awesome answers to. So let's bring in our two panelists and get the session underway. Welcome to Dennis Lange from the Manitoba Agriculture. He is the soybean and pulse specialist, and Paul Hermans, who is an area agronomist in Eastern Ontario with Pioneer Seeds. Dennis, tell us what it's like out in Manitoba these days.
Well, we've had a pretty nasty storm that moved through on Friday and then again Sunday. My back door is about 3/4 filled with snow going onto the deck. There's a whole over 3/4 of it is filled. It's quite interesting, and yeah, we couldn't see more than maybe 30 feet yesterday out in the flats here down in Emerson Way.
Yeah, it's still, we're a bit the same with the wind blowing, and actually my front lawn was covered with snow. It's now bare because the wind blew it all into a 4-foot drift in front of the house, but it's still not as bad as Kamchatka. They got 6 feet of snow with high winds, and actually they have drifts against some of the buildings up to the 4th floor. And so like the Kamchatka Peninsula makes us, we should all just say, oh, the weather here is balmy. Paul, Eastern Ontario getting hit, or how are things out there?
Overall, not bad, Peter. I mean, it's going to be cold tonight, but we're building up a bit of those moisture reserves that we didn't have in this growing season. So we have some white stuff in the ground, but we're getting, we had about almost a foot there last week, but then we get the melts, it goes away. But we're doing pretty good, I think, overall. Yeah, the days are getting longer. That's a positive thing.
100%. Like spring will come. And when you say moisture, the Kamchatka people are really worried when all that snow melts, because they had 6 feet of snow, so actually 6.5 feet of snow. They had over 10 feet of snow in December. And so when all that snow melts, they are worried about a lot of flooding. I don't, like, rarely, Paul, we have to worry about soil moisture reserves, but you guys probably had wells going dry and all that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly. There were still people in December, Peter, that were hauling water. So that's not that long ago, in December evenly, yeah. So I think we're starting to get caught up in everything else. But yeah, it was a challenge for sure this fall in lots of parts of Eastern Ontario.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, no, I know the yield showed that for sure, but I didn't realize they were still that dry. And meanwhile, Mark says our tiles were running full tilt on most farms last week. So that's a good indication that soil recharge is good. Dennis, you're in the Red River Valley. Water's not a big issue for you, not like Saskatchewan?
No, it was quite interesting last fall. Come September, we ended up getting a lot of rain, and into October, and everybody thought the fertilizer application was going to be done. Everything was wet, the standing water, all this, and then we got a week of cold weather in early October, and all of a sudden we got some frost, and we started to see a few farmers go and put fertilizer on, and they ended up extending the fertilizer application timing, and it's amazing how much fertilizer went on after that frost. Everything just kind of the frost took a lot of that moisture out, kind of that freeze thaw thing, and a lot of farmers got lots done last fall. So we're in good shape, I think, overall in Manitoba. The snow that we got recently here is more wind than anything else. Like all the, you drive across the field or drive down the road, and a lot of it just blew into the yards. So we'll have to see how the rest of the winter goes. But we're in a bit of a deep freeze the next week and a half. So it'll, especially with Manitoba Ag Days going on, so it'll definitely be cold. So.
Yeah, Paul whines about how cold it is where he is, and meanwhile Dennis says, "Come on, that's warm."
Yeah, t-shirt weather, Hawaiian shirt weather, as you can tell.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the wild shirt competition because Dennis is a wild shirt guy, but Paul missed the memo, so he's not got his wild shirt on. I wore my pink flamingo shirt tonight, so that's as wild as it gets for Wheat Pete. But no, very cool. And so it's really interesting to me because a lot of these we're talking soybean seeding rates, but the number one on-farm research trial, if you talk to a lot of these organizations that actually coordinate on-farm research trials, I think Manitoba Soybean Growers or Pulse Growers has one, Dennis.
And yes, they do that.
And they will often say that the number one trial that they do year after year after year is soybean seeding rates. So why is it that it seems like there's always so much interest there, and how do we sort out what the right rate is, or am I making it overly complicated? Paul, what do you say?
Well, Peter, and maybe I could get Jay to bring up slide number 1, but it depends, right? That's the agronomist version of it, and it depends.
We're not allowed to say that tonight. Come
on. a lot of things, and I just put this up here, Peter. Last week I spoke at the Ontario CCA conference in London, and we did a poll with the phones and asked folks what was the average population in your area, and you can see by the chart here, it's all over the map. But it depends on a lot of different factors. In Eastern Ontario, white mold's a big disease in our area. We're really trying to manage that. And depending on yield level, we're down into 100, 120,000 seeds per acre in really good, fertile, high yielding conditions. So it depends if you're no-till, crop rotation, and a whole bunch of different things that growers have to look at it year in and year out.
Yeah, for sure. And I look at that, and of course, the bigger the number, the more people said that number, and so there's 180 and 180K and 180,000 are all the same, and so that would be the big one, right? For sure. But I'm surprised, Paul, in that because there's nothing over 200,000, and we have agronomists in South Lambton on the truly heavy clays there that would say 200,000 is not close to enough to start with on their truly heavy clays. So I'm actually just surprised that there isn't any higher numbers on that chart.
Well, I think a lot of it depends on a couple different things too. Like if I've been, 28, 29 years with Pioneer, our varieties have changed a lot. We got a lot more aggressive, bushier type of varieties. And then you look at seed treatments, right? We didn't have seed treatments that we have today. So we don't lose as many plants as we did 20, 25 years ago. And then quite frankly, growers are doing a good job from a management agronomy standpoint that we're getting more seeds coming up per acre, that we don't need some of these higher rates. And I can understand there's some of the heavier clays like you talked about in different areas, Peter, in Southern Ontario that would go higher. But in generally, we're ratcheting down, and rightly so, based on conditions. And when I talk that's my area for Eastern Ontario. I want to point that out.
Yep. No. And so how does that align with your data, Dennis?
Well, let's just say Manitoba and Ontario are different. Manitoba has heavier clays. We have colder soil. The one thing I always stress with growers is when we talk when we're talking seeding rates, are we talking seeding rates or are we talking plant population? That's because there's a big difference. Growers in Manitoba, narrow row production. If you're looking at a 8-inch row spacing, 9-inch, 7-inch row spacing, you're planting 200,000 seeds to get a range of 140 to 160. If you're in a row spacing, like a 22 or a 30, then you're looking at more like that 175 to 180 planted, and you still want to be in that 140 to 160 range. And that's the one thing I always try to stress with growers is do your stand counts and see how good a job you're doing with your stand counts. Because myself, I farm as well, and last year, planted 200,000 seeds on my 8-inch row spacing. 3 weeks after planting, where are my numbers? Anywhere from 80 to 100,000 plants per acre emerging, right? It did get a little better, ended up with 130, but that's the difference between Manitoba and Ontario. Even again, I'm using air seeder, so if you're using a planter, you're getting more accurate. You can be a lot more accurate, and I think that's why a lot of growers are still doing these trials, is because they're trying different pieces of equipment. They want to see what the actual differences are between your planters and your air seeders, and also to the new equipment that they're buying. They're trying to see how much of a difference it is. But really, Manitoba research kind of shows, regardless of row spacing, your economics show that between 140 and 160,000 plants per acre establishes where you kind of want to be to find that balance between weed control and disease pressure and all that. So that's kind of what we're looking at for establishment.
Yeah, really interesting. Sean Castile showed some data. I forget exactly when, but he did a seeding rate trial in Indiana. And so, Dennis, like, your numbers are phenomenally interesting. You dropped 200 and you hope to end up kind of with 140 or 130. You ended up with 130. That means you basically had 65% stand establishment, or you lost a third of those seeds didn't end up making a plant. So your attrition is horrendous from that perspective.
Yeah.
In Sean Castile's data, that it didn't matter what their seeding rate was, their final stand ended up being, I don't quote me because I just can't quite remember exactly, but it was something like 110 or 120,000 final. And if they seeded at 200,000, they just had way more attrition. So, and Dave Hooker in the chat is saying the exact same thing, like optimum seeding rate, but is that really what we should target? Should we be targeting the optimum final plant stand? And Dennis, that's exactly what you're talking about. Paul, when you look at that, like, are we missing the boat in Ontario that we're not kind of assessing that final plant stand?
Well, I think a lot of times we go out, Peter, and we do that, what emerged, right? And a couple of weeks after planting and stuff is up, we do that stand count and everything else, and we tend to forget about it and not do a final stand at the end of the year, because there's so many different factors, from disease to insects to water availability and everything else, that can affect that. And when I'm sitting down talking with growers, the biggest thing that I'm looking at yield level. I'm a 6'2" tall Dutch Canadian, and if I got beans up to my waist or chest high, that's a really good growing environment. If I'm down to my knees or lower, it's just we don't have the yield environment. So I think that plays a big factor into that. And if you go to slide number 7, there was some interesting summary that Adam Gaspar did, that looking at attrition rates, and a lot of it based on yield level. So the top green bar is your high yield environments. There was basically little to no attrition loss. But if you look at the yellow bar at the bottom with your lower yielding environments, it dropped off significantly, especially when you get into lower yield environments. And quite frankly, that could be, you think about lower yield environments, usually don't have the water holding capacity. It could be poor drainage, wetter conditions, more insect pressure, that kind of stuff that takes it out. So that's me, we're sitting down is just figuring it on a field by field basis to come up with those population rates.
So that's really interesting, because Mark in the chat is saying that the lower we go on our high yield, lower we go on our population, the higher our yield. So that just means Mark's a really high yield grower because he's not getting that plant attrition. Is that sort of the way you would read that, Paul? Although
that's the way we read it, and it again, a lot of it I think depends on that emergence rates, like Dennis talked about. We did a trial in 2024, and if you can go to slide 3, it was a wet year, and we did 80, 120, 160. So on the left-hand side is what the yields that we got out of it. But you look at the emergence rates that we had on the right-hand side, they were just phenomenal. But that was the conditions that we had that year: wetter soils. We weren't dry. We didn't have to, go deeper for proper emergence, and we had a good stand right off the get-go. That kind of went into that yield environment, and you may be wondering, why did we go the 120, the 81, 160? So a lot of growers were at 160. How can we manage? And we always talk within Pioneer that we go out and do at least 40,000 differences increments to be able to see if there's differences from a plant population standpoint.
Right. So in that particular year, it looks like there's a small yield advantage to 160 over 120, but once you factor in seed costs, probably not a profitable yield advantage. Is that fair?
That's fair. And it's, again, this is average data. So we did this across a bunch of sites, from the Peterborough, Toronto area through Eastern Ontario, and then also the Maritimes. And if you start going more into the yield environments within that, the 8120 would be, in the higher yield environments, we're yielding more than the 160, and then you start doing the economics. But again, 1 year, one snapshot, certain conditions, right? So again, it all depends on those factors that I put up at the start of the first slide.
The one thing I'd like to kind of jump in on this one here is, over the years I've seen lots of poor stands of soybeans when we're talking growers planting 200,000 seeds and ending up with 80 to 90,000 plants per acre established, and they're thinking, wow, it's the end of the world. It's not great. The stands are too low. We've always seen good yields. However, we have herbicide tolerant varieties that we can go back in and spray multiple times and make sure we keep our weed control at bay or in check. Because what we've seen in other crops like dry beans, for example, if you have a thin stand, your weed control can get out of hand in a hurry. And I think that's the one factor that we always have to think about when we're talking plant stands, is that, okay, fine, you're at 110, 120,000. That might also mean you might have one more application of glyphosate during the growing season to help keep those weeds at bay, because that's always a challenge, especially in Manitoba. The example I gave earlier with my own field, it was 3 weeks before we finally started to get those stands coming up. And by then we're almost at the crop insurance deadline. So then you have to make a decision what you want to do. In the end, it worked out fine. Yield was, mid 40s. I was happy with the way it looked. Weed control was fine. But it is something that you have to be on top of when you start, especially in Manitoba, when you start dropping your populations, and you start getting weed control issues.
But the same would be true here, right, Paul? And actually, I think if you don't you have a slide 4 maybe, or what
Yes.
slide?
So slide 4. So again, what we like, you take a look at it, Peter, and for folks listening, like, if you look at your components of yield, so yield on a per acre basis is basically seed weight. I want to get as much weight of soybean seed off, and that's made up, plants per acre, pods per plant, seeds per pod, and then the weight of the seed. And when we did this data and across the variety, there was no differences in the seeds per pound. And that's basically, that doesn't change with the population. That's more a genetic component. So I was just summarizing some of my trials that we did last year, and I did seed counts, and we're getting 300 to 400 seeds difference per pound based on variety. So variety differences for sure, but when we come to a seeding rate, we didn't see that. And then your seeds per pod, and I can show that next, we didn't see any differences basically in seeds per pod. So it's a balance of how many plants do I have, how many branches or nodes, and then how many flowers and pods can I make? And that's, where's that balance and difference? And I know Eric Richter, he's with NK, did some really interesting work, and it's that 2 million nodes per acre is kind of the ideal that we're striving for. So where's that balance? And again, I think that comes into the biggest thing is yield environment and how big that plant can grow and how many nodes, pods, flowers, and everything else put on. And I know there's other factors, planting date and everything else that come into that, but that was interesting. And if you look on here, and hopefully you can see this with the pictures, right? So on the left-hand side is 80,000, on the right-hand side is 160. Well, look at the differences in the plant health. the top picture shows that the leaves were starting to senesce earlier in the higher population. And again, it all comes back to that stress component. How close we put plants and they start getting stressed of getting closer and really change how that plant grows.
Yeah, but it also, to Dennis's point, right? Dennis, when you look at that bottom right picture and you can see the high population on the right-hand side is senescing, but that canopy also looks thicker than the lower population on the left. And so to your point about weed control, and we often don't discuss that, but I think that's a pretty important point.
Well, most definitely, because I know, especially in Manitoba now, where we've been dealing with, some of the herbicide-resistant weeds like kochia and water hemp, just like Ontario has been on the water hemp side. We need to keep that crop competition. We may see growers this year dropping seeding rates to some degree in some areas. Areas that were more prone to white mold this year, we had a lot of August white mold this year, and in some of the worst case scenarios, we actually did see some yield loss. Where there just was such a dense canopy. So I think moving forward on certain fields, growers are going to adjust their populations down a little bit, depending if they're on the higher side. But that's the other factor. Again, white mold for us, the last year we've had any issues with white mold was back in 2013, and that never really affected the provincial average. So that's been a while, right? So this year we had, every field that we did as part of the soybean disease survey in August, they had, almost 75% white mold is in it that you could find in the field, but the amount of white mold that was in there was still minimal in most fields. But those are all the factors that I help growers and industry with to try to figure out what's the best route. If you want it, there's that slide 2 of mine that I put up, but I want to address that one too here. So yeah, so this is from the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers app. And it's some work that Ramona Moore did a number of years ago. And when they're talking plant population, this is, of course, plant population, when you're doing your stand count, and if you're in that 140 to 160, that's what they consider being in the good range. So where that's what you're targeting, that 140 to 160, both the weed and disease pressure should be reduced, resulting in optimum yield and economic return. If you're greater than that, yields are still there. But you also, disease pressure might be a little bit more prone. And I think with a lot of growers, seed costs are expensive. So if you have a high-end planter and you're really trying to fine-tune your planting rates and try to drop your seeding rates down and still be in that range, that's where the planters really come into play nowadays, because you can get that really good seed to soil contact. But with that being said, we have had fields over the years with low populations. And depending on the growing season, depending on the rains, if you get rain in July and August, I think the worst field I've ever seen was back in 2013. And it was actually done by a contractor doing a trial for Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers. The grower had planted 200,000 seeds and ended up with 64,000 plants per acre.
Wow.
You could walk diagonally across the field and not hit a plant, right? But with really good weed control, that field ended up putting out 45 bushels that year. So it's not like it's the end of the world. I always tell growers, if you got a lower stand, just keep it clean. Soybeans have a great ability to recover. And as long as you get the rain, that's the big thing. If you get timely rains in July and August, that makes the yield right there.
Yeah, really interesting. And so lots of great questions and comments in the chat. And Dave Hooker, to this chart, Dennis is saying, it's plant population. It's not actually seeding rates. So that's a really important point. So let's go to our clip, because it's kind of funny. We're all talking lower seeding rates. Let's see what Horst Bonner, our provincial soybean specialist, has to say, and then we can come back and argue about that.
And the recommendation right now, 165,000 on 15-inch rows with a planter, right? With a planter unit.
And the reason we point that out is, of course, with the drill in 15-inch, we're at 177. We need a little more because we have a little less emergence, a little lower emergence with the drill compared to a planter.
Yeah. Now, I just say you're thinking about where those recommendations need to go in the future,
Right.
and a great trial right here. You have got 90,000, 160,000, and 230,000, and it really is telling a story.
Well, it's very interesting, right? When you do this kind of work, what you try to do is you set up a response curve. So you have a lower number, kind of a normal number, and a pretty high number, right? And that's why we have that 230. Well, in 15-inch rows on nicer, lighter soils like this, 230 and 15 should be lots, right? So here's the really interesting take home. Now, this is the third year of the study, and we have 3 varieties: short season, an adapted, and a long season variety, and then 3 dates. We tried to hit April, May, and June. This year, the first date was actually April 12th, but last year was April. The point of the story is this, right? We would expect that with that very late date, maybe the 230 would win, because in June, the plants are shorter.
You want
need
that big
more.
number.
That's right. But with early planting, you shouldn't need it, because the plants have more time to bush, and actually a lower seeding rate is often the way it turns out. Here's the long and the short of it. It really depends on your location, because right here at Elora, every date, every variety, the 230, every replication yielded more than the 160 and the 90. Now, not a lot more, but I'm telling you, it's quite a story, because I would not have expected that 230 to win in every stinking case, right? I mean, it's almost kind of like, well, what are you doing seeding at 160 when the 230 always wins?
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are MMP, the Canola School, and Ruminating with RealAg. Ruminating with RealAg is a podcast series that focuses on all things bovine. We're here to chew the cud on everything from the latest in cattle genetics to how to keep your herd happy with rotational grazing to winter feeding techniques and everything in between. Find it on realagriculture.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
So that's a really fun clip to throw in there in terms of why aren't we all just seeding 230 if that's, and I mean, Elora's soil is gorgeous soil, and they did it at several sites. They did it at Kempville. Dave Hooker's in the chat saying they also did it at Ridgetown. So but the other question was around drill versus planter, and I think Dennis, you started off there, right? That with the drill you're going to seed a higher population. Mark's saying 20,000. Horst is at 12,000. So for sure that plays, but why aren't we just seeding more if that's actually giving higher yields? Paul, what do you say?
It comes down to I think it's the genetics and how we can branch and stuff. And if you could just bring up slide number 5, maybe it helps prove a little bit of a point. But I took a snapshot when we did this research work, and a picture's worth 1,000 words, Peter. On the bottom, you got the 80,000, 120, 160 in terms of that branching capability at the 80 and 120 versus 160. We did, pods, nodes, seeds per pod, and trifoliates and stuff. And it comes in my world. If I did 220 or 230 and we had white mold, it would be just a disaster, and my phone would be ringing 24/7 in the complaints, right? So, and again, that's what differences in areas, but it just kind of shows, I think, here on how we have to balance out in terms of seeding rates and pods and nodes, and then plants per acre depending on yield environment. So kudos to Horst, just good research, but for my area, I don't think I would go on the majority of my ground at those levels.
Well, and I do think, and part of the reason that we pulled that clip is that it is good data, but everybody in the chat is all talking, optimum economic yield, not just, come on, Johnson, get off the highest yield. It's not bragging rights at the coffee shop that matters. It's actually bragging rights at the bank that matters. And so Horst's yield gain generally wasn't enough to pay for that extra, because that's 70,000 more seeds. And so 70,000 more seeds, Mark says is $40 an acre. It's going to take at a minimum 3 bushels to pay for that. And the chances of that get pretty slim. Dennis, any like the other part of this that I think really does play is the disease aspect that you've both brought up. And Dennis, I'm really intrigued that you think you have growers that are going to reduce their seeding rate based on 1 year of white mold, when that's the first year they've seen that pressure in 12 years, right? 2013 to 2025, they go 12 years with no white mold, and 1 year is going to make the difference.
I think the adjustment on the white mold, I guess I'll start with that one, I guess, is going to be on fields where the white mold was very severe. Like, we're not talking, there are fields that, that we're probably looking at 10 bushel losses on the yield. So if those fields are, well sheltered, lots of tree cover, like along the river, those types of things, that's where we're going to see the populations drop. I think at the end of the day, with respect to Horst's comments there, the yield is probably fine, but the economics don't make sense, right? If you're putting that much extra seed down and you're only getting a smidgen better in yield, farmers are, especially this year with the economics of farming the way it is right now. Our provincial budgets came out, and soybeans were on the positive $2, just over $2 a bushel, $2 an acre profitability after all your expenses are in. So you gotta still hit your targets. You gotta hit that, for Manitoba, we try to hit that 140 to 160 of plants established. And knowing that when you're going out to the field, you're doing some checks. I think the cheapest for a grower who's solid seeding, the cheapest investment they can make, and the most that will give them the most bang for your buck, is go out and buy yourself a 28.25-inch hula hoop and do some stand counts a month after, just to see where you're at. If you're doing row crop 30-inch or 15-inch, then you're doing your stand counts. Just see how good a job your seeding equipment's doing, because I think a lot of people, are looking at, in some instances, looking at new equipment. And the first question I ask when I said, well, okay, so what kind of mortality do you have with your old equipment? And I get a blank look in some instances. And I'm like, okay, well, then you should really know if you're spending the extra money, you should really know what your old equipment is giving you. Because if your new equipment isn't giving you anything more, then you got to rethink whether or not that's going to be the best option there for you.
Yeah, and so just on the stand counts, Dennis, can we pull up Dennis's slide 1, please, Jay? Because I like your hula hoop. I think this is the one with the hula hoop. Yeah.
Yep.
So just walk us through that, Dennis.
Well, so this is a 28.25-inch hula hoop, and the reason I use that, and this is something a colleague of mine we kind of developed here over the years. It's an easy multiplication factor. So if you're in a, let's say under 15-inch solid seeded situation, use this 28.25-inch hula hoop. That gives you, the multiplication factor of 10,000. So it's easy math. So if you got 13 plants, it's 130,000 plants. And the reason this is kind of important, and one thing we haven't touched on here yet, but this is something in Manitoba this last year, it was pretty predominant, is we had a, fairly dry after seeding in some instances, and growers were concerned about soil erosion in some areas, or just got too much rain right after seeding, and they wanted to go roll their soybeans to help deal with some of the rocks, and they couldn't do it right after seeding, so they had to wait until the stand was up. Knowing what your stand is, and knowing if you're rolling at, let's say, second trifoliate, then you have to know how much damage you're causing. If you're only losing, a plant or two in that hula hoop, then you're good. But if you're losing, 10, 15%, then it's time to maybe go back and come back another day. So that's this hula hoop I carried along with me a lot in seeding time. And a little funny story, a colleague of mine sent me a picture one day of her dad, and he was measuring on the floor, measuring a hula hoop. And she asked, what are you doing? Well, and the dad says, Dennis Lange said 28.25 inches. I want to make sure I got a 28.25-inch hula hoop. So, it's just something to think about for the growers in Manitoba that are narrow row production. So
do they actually make? Can I go to I don't know, Party Central and buy a 28.25-inch hula hoop that's made?
Yeah, it's the local giant tiger in our area. We went out last year, and sometimes if they're not quite, if they're 28 and you have to nick the little tape and just extend a little bit, you get pretty darn close. But 28 and a quarter inch hula hoop at those stores, $3. That's definitely worth the investment. So
Yeah, cool. I love it. And so just from that perspective, Dave Hooker's put is in the chat, and that's neat. So he looked at Horst's study, and they actually got 6 bushel per acre across the 9 site years. So 3 locations, 3 years, 9 site years, 6 bushel per acre to 230,000 over 90,000. And I would never have anticipated it was that high a difference, right? Like that is surprising. So, but Paul, you did mention that like white mold would just wipe you out. It's really intriguing to me. Your area gets hit so hard with white mold. Meanwhile, here in the Southwest, I don't know. We get white mold, but it's just not devastating the way it is for your area.
I think a lot of that, Peter, is just temperature, and you always talk about the disease triangle and environment and everything else. And you folks are usually a little bit hotter and drier than we are. We just seem to get those timely rains just around flowering time and everything else that help with it and everything else. And you talk about, seeding rates. If you can pull up slide 6, one big thing, and again, I know I'm focusing on mold because it's a big thing, but 1 + 1 = 3, and you're probably saying, Paul, what the heck are you talking about? But if I got a variety that is more mold prone, and then I have a variety that's also weak in the knees from a lodging standpoint, that's really, really going to add up. So I did some quick just caliper calculations out there, and I know we're going from 10 to 6 to like 7 mils. That's not much in terms of diameter, but the difference between the 10 and the 6, if we're pushing rates too much, we're going to have thinner stocks, a potential for more lodging and everything else. And a lot depends on the yield environment, but those are other factors that I look at to help our growers to combat with white mold and that standability and variety type and everything else, along with population, factors into those different decision making points at the end of the day.
Yeah, actually, Paul, that 10 or almost 11 millimeters from a strength perspective compared to a 7, that's massive, right? Like that is probably twice the strength of standing, or maybe more. You'd have to get into the actual physics of it, but that's a huge difference in standability for sure. If that's one of those issues. So if you're growing, one of those pioneer and list varieties that never stand, you just have to lower your population so that it gets a thicker stem and that it stands.
What was that
right?
now, Peter? That was a bit of a shot there. I think you're misled. Our lawyers will be calling you tomorrow, right?
Oh yeah, no, and I was being facetious for anyone listening.
I know, Peter.
Who didn't pick that up. It was just a bit of fun, but I do find that really intriguing that you can increase your stem diameter that much, and again, it's just a small sample, but it really is I think something to consider when lodging might be that big issue. So back a while, just flip back and see here. Sorry, I forget who asked, but someone asked, do we change our seeding rate? Yeah, here it is. Jeanette says, is there a difference in target soybean populations between different plant architectures? So if it's a fairly upright variety versus a bush variety, do we change our plant population based on plant architecture? Dennis, what do you think?
I would say you'd change where the variety is, what type of seeding equipment you'd be using for that versus changing your plant population. If you're going with something more of a row crop, you want to make sure something's going to fill the row as best you can, kind of thing, versus having something that's just empty ground, right? As far as plant population goes, I still like to see that magic range like we talked about before. But when you're talking, plant bush versus more upright types, it's just more that the row spacing that you'd want to select on that, because some varieties might not be suited as well for row crop production as they would be for solid seed production.
Yep, Paul?
I agree. Yeah, a lot depends on that row width and everything else. And then, you go back to one of those pictures I had. Population really changes that capability of that plant to branch more or not. Depending, and it's going to depend on the variety as well, because we do have row width or canopy width. Every company would have a score for that, but it comes down to row width, and I think more yield environment as well, because yield environment ultimately drives how that plant's going to potentially change and add more branches and nodes and pods on, and planting date and other factors as well, Peter.
Yeah,
So,
and I think
if I'm on the loam soils that's outside of Ottawa here, right, just phenomenal yield environments. We can get 70, 80 bushels, and you drive, 10 or 20 minutes south and get into sandier soils that we're into a 35, 40 bushel environment. Those same varieties are going to act a little bit different based on that yield environment.
right, and so I think probably, and Dennis's answer is bang on from this perspective. I think soil type also plays into that as
Yep.
well, because if you're planting on a clay soil, it's just not going to branch the way it is if you're planting on a beautiful loam at Woodstock, right? A nice silt loam at Woodstock. And so there's plant
Yeah,
architecture, but there's also soil type and like your slide said, yield environment, right?
exactly. And then Peter, like, from a research standpoint, we started all of our research off in 30-inch rows and beans. And it's just a lot of that's because of equipment and just what we have to do from a research standpoint. If you look at a 1 through 8 ranking with varieties in a 30-inch row compared to a 15 or 7, they basically will hold the same ranking, but obviously there's going to be a differences in yield based on row width spacing, a 7 versus a 15 versus a 30 too, right? So that's just I just wanted to bring that fact out, that how we started off is with 30-inch rows, and generality we're running at 140 to 160,000 in Eastern Ontario and Quebec. In our research work is where our populations are set at.
Gosh, I thought you'd be doing them at 7.5s where you really get high yields. So you'd get that genetic potential, not this 30-inch row stuff where you always have too much light for the plant.
But I guess it again, if you look at planting dates, trying to go earlier, get branching more and everything else. I think, and again, our varieties are a lot different today than they were 20, 25 years ago.
So here's another question or comment in the chat. So Bill says, I notice quicker emergence and a little more vigor with high populations. I always attribute it to the seeds helping each other break out of any crust. So is that part of the thought process as well? Do we actually see quicker emergence, more vigor with higher populations, Dennis, or is that just an old wives' tale?
If a stand was having trouble pushing through, more plants would potentially push through the crust a little easier. However, with that being said, a lot of it comes down to how good a job you do, or how good a job of seeding you do. If you're going with a planter that's very consistent with the depth and good seed moisture, great. If you're going with an air seeder that the seed's bouncing around to different depths, you're going to have, even though at a higher population, that's not going to help you anything. So the consistency of where that seed is situated in that nice, mellow ground with some moisture will push way quicker than even a low population will push way quicker than something that where that seed is at different depths, slightly different depths. So not so much on plant population, because like I say, I've seen as high as 250,000 plants per acre established in a field, where because the farmer ended up, let's just say he went back to the seed plant a few too many times, and then ended up planting over 300,000 plants. And that 200,000, 230,000 stand came up just as well as anything else in the area, even at lower populations. So
Interesting. Paul, what about in your clays? Or I guess you don't have real clays in Eastern Ontario.
Yeah, they're not as heavy as what you would have down your way, Peter, for sure, and everything else. And I guess the person's talking about potential from a crusting standpoint. I still think I'm going to stick with my populations and manage Mother Nature, depending what she throws at me with equipment. So I might bring in a rotary hoe or run back across the field, lighten up the planter units if I got to break a crust from that standpoint. But totally understanding that the more plants that we have, you know, the group together, misery likes company, and we can push through easier through that crust.
Yeah, but I do think, and we've seen this on heavy clay soils, that if you can get a whole bunch of seeds pushing when you get that crust, you definitely get better emergence. You still get some attrition, but if it's one seed all by itself, because you're in narrow rows and you're dropping a low population, boy, you want to have good conditions to make sure you don't lose too many of those seeds, or I think you're going to be in trouble. So Dave Hooker, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Sure. Peter, I'm just thinking too, like if I look at the history of replant that I've had in my area, and you're looking at lower plant stands, in generality, we might have 1 or 2% per year for soybeans across the board, because we track that, right? Like, your units come in and they're done different from a replant standpoint. We had 1 year where it was up to almost 20%, but that was because of frost that basically annihilated fields across the board. So other than that frost situation, and you take a look at replant, we generally in our area don't have a lot of replant because of really low plant stands.
Interesting. So you think your stand establishment is quite good then?
Exactly.
That your attrition rate is really low.
Is really low, and they're good enough that we don't have to go in and top them up or replant or do a total replant basically at the end of the day, right? Other than that 1 year, and I can't remember the year, but we had frost that it was the end of May, whatever it was, and just annihilated a bunch of fields completely.
Yeah. So like on my own farm, I planted my beans in the spring of 25 on the 28th and 29th of April. And Dennis, to your, when are you going to count that? I needed to wait 5 weeks before I could get out there and actually know what my final stick is. May came in cold and backward. And I mean, I'm seeding with a drill, but it's the John Deere 750 or 1560 opener. It's as good as a drill gets basically for seed depth, but man, they just took forever to get out of the ground. And there was significant attrition. I knew I was seeding early. I seeded about 200,000 and we ended up with about 125 final, which is just pretty low from that perspective. So as we go through this thought process, I really do think you have to look at time when you're planting, soil conditions when you're planting, what is your soil type, what are your seed treatments. I actually think that matters because we do a lot of IP beans don't necessarily have the same treatments on them. Some of them do, but I think those things also play. And Dennis, so Paul's saying he doesn't get much attrition. In Manitoba, it sounds like typically you get pretty significant attrition. Is that fair?
Well, we can on certain years, like for example, last year, planting conditions in mid-May were great. Soil conditions were good. And then we had 10 days of cold, crappy weather, and those beans just sat there. And, depending on how much straw you had in the field, all those kind of things, that's where that, 3 weeks afterwards, I'm doing stand counts and the crop insurance deadline is 2 days from now. I actually did have seed booked just as a precaution. And then, I went and did a stand count on the Friday, and I went into some of the areas that we had a lot of excess moisture, and I started seeing beans push through there. And I'm like, okay, we're good. So for the most part, there have been some instances where we've had to reseed. But generally, I tell growers, if you're worst case scenario, 80 to 100,000 plants per acre established, walk away. Don't look at it. Just keep the field clean. Don't worry about reseeding. If you're below that, in that 60, 65 range, it gets a little dicey, but it's generally, it always works out good as long as you have good weed control in a herbicide tolerant system. On the conventional system, that's where I always tell growers to go a little higher on a population just because of the weed pressure that you may have, and you want to have enough competition with those weeds. You don't want to have a thin stand in a conventional soybean variety because your challenges with weed control can be quite great. But in herbicide tolerant systems, it's a little different.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And there's some great chats or comments in the chat that fit right in, and we'll come back to those, but we do need to get in our last read of the night before we run out of time. So Jay, if we could do our last read, and we'll come back to a bunch more great questions.
The Agronomist is brought to you by Ruminating with RealAg, MMP, and the Canola School. From pre-seeding seeder setup and checks to pest ID and advice on nutrient management decisions to tips on determining swath timing, RealAg's Canola School covers every facet of the canola growing season. The Canola School is made possible through a sponsorship by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola. Learn more at canolaschool.com.
Yeah, really important to get the sponsors in, because we couldn't do this without sponsors. So we thank the sponsors and absolutely need them to make this happen. So Jim, his comment is, and Dennis, I think fits right in with where you just finished off with, is that he's an IP soybean grower, and his comment is, man, if I only dropped a seeding rate of 150,000, and again, Dave Hooker's going to say, wait a minute, that's a seeding rate, that's not a final population, and we need to I think do a better job of looking at those differences. But 150,000 in IP beans, he just thinks his weed control would be very, very difficult. Whereas with traded beans, I think that, you know, we can go in and clean them up with Enlist or with glyphosate or with dicambo, depending on what the traits are. We have all those options, right? And Paul, you have a bunch of IP beans in the East as well. You'd agree with that, would you not?
You know, for sure, Peter. And we control, especially IP beans. That's a different story altogether.
Yeah, 100%. So Dave Hooker wants to know, Paul, how do seed companies determine the ideal rate range versus different varieties, or is every variety the same?
Well, we do a lot of population work in corn, right? But quite frankly, in beans, we don't do any population work. It tends to be more local in what we're doing and issues that come up and everything else, Peter. And, you know, I couldn't tell you to go to the Pioneer.com webpage and look for seeding rates for beans. For corn, yes, but for beans, quite frankly, no.
So that's why you did those studies, and you did one in 2015 that showed different results than your one in 2024, right?
Well, the 2015 one we just did, quite frankly, was a 120 versus 170, and we did 30 versus 15 inch. And then we did 2 different planting dates, and then we did fungicide, no fungicide. So, and it all came about just trying to answer, are we going too high, and how can we control white mold in our area, and do 30-inch rows help? In that particular study, the 30-inch were just as good as the 15s, but especially when we planted earlier on. And again, I'm going to caveat, Eastern Ontario is a different world because of white mold, and that's the biggest problem that we have to deal with.
Yeah. Dennis said that last year they could lose 10 bushels to white mold. In your area, Paul, like how big can the white mold losses be?
So you look at yield maps, we're 60, 65 bushel in the field, and right, you get into the white mold areas, we're down to 15, 20 here. That was back in 2023. We're 30, 40 bushels that we could lose easily.
Yeah, and that 10 bushels that I meant.
Sorry, what was that, Dennis?
I was just saying that 10 bushels was a worst case scenario where, you know, it was a very sheltered area, very little air movement through it. And I saw some pictures of it, and definitely it was one of the worst areas I've seen. Most fields, you know, you're driving by, you can see the odd plant poking through, and you're like, okay, yeah, there's white mold there, but generally the stand was still pretty good and the yield came off good. But again, in some instances it was severe. So
yeah,
Dennis, we drive by and we can smell it. So that's how bad it is.
Yeah. And
we don't have to worry about looking for it. We smell it.
Yeah. And we do sometimes get that here in southwestern Ontario, but it's so much rare. And yeah, my good friend Dan just put in the chat that he'd be happy with a touch of white mold in South Lambton. And that's exactly right. On that heavy clay soil, white mold is gold, baby. If you get white mold, you've got gold. So, and Mark asked the question, I think it's a really good question, but like, what do you consider a good percentage of plants to be established versus your seed drop? Do you expect only to lose 5%? Do you expect to lose 10%? What is that number? Dennis, what do you think?
You know, a lot depends on the type of seeding equipment you have, right? If, you know, you can plant 170 with a, you know, either a 15 or a 30-inch row of spacing, plant 170, end up with 150, you're in the ballpark. If you're planting 200,000 and you end up with 110, that's an issue. If you're still in that 150 to 160 range, you're compensating for a few things. You're compensating for uneven emergence. You're compensating for uneven seeding depth. Just because in Manitoba our soils can be quite cool for a long period of time. In the presentation that was given earlier, they start talking planting in mid-April in Ontario in some areas. We still got snow in Manitoba in mid-April, right? So we're thinking if we get in the fields and start planting May 2nd, May 3rd, if it's a nice warm spring, great. Most times growers are shooting for mid-May before they get going, get some of the other crops in, get the cereals in first. So those are all the factors that you kind of got to look into, but it all depends. And we haven't even talked seed quality here too, because there's also that aspect of it. Those years with the low populations in that 60 to 70,000, that was because of dry seed. Running dry seed through an air seeder, not turning down your air volume, and now you've lost. That's why it's always really important to do your stand counts afterwards, so you know what kind of job your equipment did.
So you do get seed damage in the air seeder with too dry seed.
Too dry a seed, yeah. We've seen that from year to year, especially if you got one of the 50 or 60 foot air seeders and you run your air volume fast enough because you don't want to plug it, right? And if that seed is 10% seed moisture, you can run into some problems. That's why it's important to know that aspect of it. So that way you can make your adjustment when you're planting, not after the fact.
Interesting. So I want to know after, because we're running out of time, Dennis, but I want to know, like, what's the critical moisture and what's the critical air pressure? And like, there's a whole lot of questions now that I have there. Paul, in Eastern Ontario,
I think, Peter, first thing is certified number one seed. We have to have 85% minimum germination, right? So we don't have 100%. So if I'm putting down 100 plants, I got to have at least 85 that's going to germinate and come up to be sold as certified number one seeds. So I think we have to keep that into the picture as well. It's not like corn, right? Corn's 90%, but quite frankly, companies strive for a lot higher than 90% germination rate, or people would be crying the blues like crazy. So take that into account. But generally, if we get 75, 80% of what's put down, we're happy. And a lot's going to depend on the year. If we have a nice, spring that's we got moisture, good germination, warm conditions, it's going to get up and get going. But if we're dry and we got to start sicking drills and planters down and looking for moisture, that's going to be a big difference. So again, my usual thing is it depends on the situation.
Yeah, really interesting. So earlier in the chat, and I think it's bang on, the trend is for lower seeding rates. The trend in corn is higher seeding rates. The trend in soybeans is lower seeding rates. But man, as you lower seeding rates, I really do think that you have to start doing a better job of getting more plants out of the seeds that you put in the ground, right? And to your point, Dennis, you clearly like the planter better than the drill. My great friend Al McCollum, right?
Don't give me trouble now.
He farms in the heavy clay soils of Elgin County, and his comment always is rows for show, drill for dough. So they plant beans with the corn planter, they plant beans with the drill, and almost always the narrow rows on that clay soil, even though things struggle, but getting those narrow rows, those plants a little bit more spread out and canopying faster, they get higher yields at the end of the day. So it's kind of a catch-22 from that perspective, right? Clearly you like narrow rows, or you wouldn't be planting 8-inch rows yourself, Dennis.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what I really like to see is just good stand establishment. That's what it really comes down to, right? Because you can put 10 growers in a room and get 10 different seeding pieces of equipment that they seed their soybeans with, and everyone says theirs is the best, right? The biggest thing is what kind of job is your seeder or air seeder doing to make sure you get the stand that you want.
So here's my last question, because we are out of time, but I'm going to go to variable rate seeding. So how big is the spread that I use when I'm doing variable rate seeding? Do I, in my high yield areas, am I down to 120,000 or 90,000? In my tough clay knolls, am I up to 230 like Horst said? How big is that spread? What should I look at from a variable rate seeding standpoint? Paul, you go first.
Yeah, I think you hit it nail on the head. It depends on yield environment. That's going to set my goalposts on either end. But I'm going to be in that 100 to 120 up to 180, 200, depending on that yield swing, which is quite a swing. You start thinking running 120 to 200, there's some cost savings to be had there, but there's some yield gains to be had there, more importantly, going down the road.
Interesting. That's a bigger spread than I thought. It's a bigger spread than most people do. Dennis, what do they do in Manitoba?
I think there's also a concern there. I think there's some validity in that, but for a lot of the growers I talk to, we're pretty flat in Manitoba in most areas, right? So there's not a lot of variability in seeding rates that we're doing. Like where we might, see some differences in some of the weaker areas, we might see growers drop the population a little bit because they want to save some money on seed. But generally, it's pretty consistent across the board. Growers, like I say, if you want to get your beans in fast, you pull out your seeder and you get her done. And if you have a planter and you like the show, you like the nice tall beans. You ever wonder why all the research or all the plots that a lot of the companies have are always in rows? They're never solid seeded. So at the end of the day, I think just making sure you get a good stand is what you need to do.
Yeah, cool. And with that, we are out of time. So thank you so much to Dennis and Paul. I think it's been a great session. There's a lot. I mean, we've beat this horse so many times, and yet there's still so much I think growers can do better. And really, the message is we're going to lower seeding rates. It means we have to get to the field and do plant counts and just make sure that attrition isn't beating us up. So thank you very much to both my guests tonight. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And whatever you do, as Dennis says, make sure you get a good soybean stand. We'll see you next week, everybody.
Thank you.